Hey, remember things? Basically, nostalgia is an emotion, or it isn't. There's some debate about that, but it definitely either is or isn't an emotion. That's the range of options available. Now, the word's been around for a few hundred years, and the feeling we assume has been around forever. It's usually triggered by interacting with something that you remember or remembering something that you remember, but it tends to show up more in times of change, like in your life. You're more likely to watch a 90s movie or play a PlayStation 1 game if things are going badly for you. But it doesn't have to be that extreme, like vinyl records. You know, you think you like them because of the sound quality or whatever, but that's not it. The reason you like vinyl records is because they stopped making iPods. They stopped making iPods, so now your iTunes library is worthless, so in revenge you found some tat to collect. It's pathetic. Once I hit the Spotify library limit, I got into cassettes, which is different. That's a different... You can tell the difference in sound quality with a cassette. It's much worse. But nostalgia tends to show up more when there's been some change, any change. So everyone gets a bit more nostalgic during unstable periods. Whether that's the coronavirus global financial crisis, when the Americans elected to have James Corden on TV. And we can see that statistically in the swell of sales of products from your childhood. The trading card industry is basically entirely reliant on there being regular crises. Because as an emotion, nostalgia is incredibly powerful. Even though it's usually triggered by bad things, it can be very positive. It lifts your mood, gives you meaning, makes you feel less alone, even though you are alone. But it can be worse, right? Remembering some things, that's nice, but you can be overtaken by nostalgia to the point that you don't just want to remember things, you want to make it the past now, which is really the driving force behind most races. Remember racism times, let's have them now. And it's that impulse which makes it so commercially successful. Like a lot of things, nostalgia's been around for ages, but for the longest time it wasn't monetized effectively until the 60s with the invention of retro. After the student movement had all hope for the future beaten out of them by the cops, they stopped looking forward and started looking to the past. Before then, there hadn't really been a way to dig up old crap from the recent past and start selling it immediately after it stopped being cool. So what the advertisers and the tastemakers and the PR people did was they went, let's dig up old crap from the recent past and start selling it immediately after it stops being cool. And what they found was that nostalgia was actually incredibly useful. You get an instant emotional connection with your audience because they remember stuff too, and you create an overwhelming yearning for an imagined past. And if you could tie that yearning to your product, you could in theory create an emotional need for your product. And they're very proud of doing this. Nostalgia has some therapeutic properties, so, you know, they're not doing open emotional manipulation, they're just doing a bit of a public service while they advertise. But it's not just in marketing now, right? Throughout culture, there is this sort of stuckness in music, in movies, and in culture. There is a sort of stuckness. In the 90s, there was this fucking idiot who was like, we've basically come up with the perfect world and we've found out all the facts, so, you know, we're done now. The Russians will never go to war again, and there's nothing left to challenge the financial free market. And that's the end of history, right? It's just going to be now forever. And that sort of became the dominant attitude of the time. Not really because of the specifics of his argument that I've misrepresented, but because the culture had slowed. There's that thought experiment. If you took music from the 90s and you played it to someone in the 60s, they're gonna be like, whoa, what the fuck? This doesn't sound anything like the Beach Boys. Where if you took music from now, went 30 years back to the 90s, they're gonna be like, okay, that's nice, thanks for sharing. That's not to say there haven't been any musical developments. Of course, 10 years ago, some guys learnt to mumble. 20 years ago, they decided to use an unusual amount of auto-tune. And K-pop, that's the one brand new genre that we've never had before. It didn't exist 30 years ago. Actually, I don't want to get on the bad side of the K-pop stands. If they get wind of this, they could wipe me off the internet. So, look, I understand that K-pop started on the 11th of April 1992 at about 5 p.m. KST. That's roughly 30 years ago, okay? Please do not come for me. So that's the one brand new genre that we've never had before, and I don't want to get on the bad side of the K-pop stands, but for a brand new genre that we've never had before. It is just noughties pop. It's just noughties pop with different lyrics. And that lyrical content has a childlike innocence. Love and drugs, the mainstays of the American pop scene, are basically a no-go. So in some ways it's actually even more nostalgic than our stuck-in-the-past mainstream pop, which is deliberate. They're intentionally employing nostalgia as a marketing tool. K-pop has this extremely corporate top-down production system where they snap up talent as preteens and make them sign what's known as slave contracts, which you should always try to avoid. You know, always read a contract through and double check that it hasn't got slave in the name. But they train their artists to perfection and then deny them a private life and food and then pump out production line hits. So in 2016, when China limited their import of Korean culture due to a disagreement over anti-ballistic missile systems, there was a concerted effort across the K-pop industry to penetrate America. K-pop had always followed the American pop trends, so the early attempts were just to make English language versions of their existing hits. But that actually had the opposite effect. Those English language versions often had worse international penetration than the originals. What they found instead was that you had to make the music's production reflect American pop music of the recent past. The K-pop agencies are the only ones actively headhunting the producers of the Jonas Brothers, for example. Maybe K-pop's existing appeal came from how nostalgic it was. So instead of trying to Americanize it, you double down and you remind people of their childhood. So now, while these agencies are starving young boys to death, they're also going, could we subliminally sample Britney Spears in this song? But it's not just K-pop, it's not just music. There is this nostalgia everywhere right now, right? Nostalgia tends to happen in waves. Like in movies, you had the Batman, Superman serials in the 40s, then 20, 30 years later, you had the Batman, Superman movies. 20, 30 years after that, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, which they've just been making at least twice a year ever since. Just open up that Spider-Man script and do a find and replace on all the character names. But that's not really about trying to smuggle in some nostalgia as a marketing ploy. That's more about the narrowing parameters of commercialism. The Hollywood studios are increasingly moving away from making little gambles to making big events. Outside of the scam known as streaming, no one's really making mid-sized movies anymore, which is absolutely deliberate. The theory is our attention is more divided than ever. People are only really going out to the movies about once a year, so the goal is now to make that movie. Instead of expanding out, creating a broad range of options that's going to be interesting to different people, some of it good, the model is to pile all of your resources and just make one giant, inoffensive theme park ride every year. Good. That's the preamble done. Now let's start the episode. Now, maybe technology is making us nostalgic because of how we use it. That feeling of instability that creates nostalgia can be caused directly by technology. Since they released the iPhone back in the noughties, we're expected to be constantly posting, and for a lot of people, having that constantly running public persona can be stress. Similarly, the extreme pushes in productivity and surveillance can make people more nostalgic. You know, Amazon doesn't give their employees time off, they just use cameras to make sure they never stop working. Classrooms are increasingly adopting surveillance technologies to squeeze maximum productivity out of school children while harvesting their data for advertisers. But maybe technology makes us nostalgic because we're surrounded by reminders of our past. We're sitting on a giant database of niche moments from your past. You don't have to be feeling nostalgic at all, but all of a sudden, your apps are going, look at this! This is you 5 years ago, look at this! All right, calm down, you know. I'll be nostalgic. And taken to the extreme, there are people who are leaving high school now and getting to an age where they might start to experiment with different interests and personalities and racial identities, but they can't escape their past because it's so thoroughly documented. But maybe technology makes us nostalgic because the algorithms themselves are nostalgic. Now, the goal of a recommendation algorithm is to predict what you'll like. But there's one key problem with that. It's not possible. So there's two approaches. There's content-based filtering, which compares the content itself. If you liked a movie that was called Space Jam, you might like a movie that's called Space Jam: A New Legacy. Or if you bought a product, it'll find another product in that category or a post with a similar keyword, that sort of thing. You like something and it finds you things that have similar attributes to that thing. Then there's collaborative filtering, which finds people with similar tastes and recommends their likes to each other. So if this person likes watching clips from the 2011 movie Real Steel and racism, and this person likes watching clips from the 2011 movie Real Steel, they might like racism, just expanded to a mass scale, right? Comparing all tastes of all people. Both ways have their limitations and drawbacks, so it's usually some kind of combination of the two, actually using like hundreds of different variations on each to pull together an overall score of recommendedness. And that seems to work, right? But no matter how it's done, it's an internal filtering system, which means instead of trying to expand people's tastes, its goal is actually to cull them. You're always recommended to be like someone else, and for the system to work at all, that person has to be like you in the first place. So on a social scale, it actually has the effect of dragging everyone together and streamlining us into a few buckets. And it's always based on data from the past. It's very difficult for new information to be introduced into these algorithms. And the platforms have so much faith in their system, they often limit your browsing ability beyond them. So it's a closed feedback loop. No new taste information can be introduced, and all recommendations are a copy of the past. Which, that's not a prediction. If someone had said to you, I like Nicolas Cage movies, so you let them pick what movie to watch out of all the Nicolas Cage movies. When they pick a Nicolas Cage movie, you can't be like, oh, I predicted that. That's, at best, that's remembering. Then the people making the content have to go along with these algorithms. But it's not just internet losers. Hollywood, always historically, it was the executives making sure that no one ever took a risk or made anything good, but now that's been outsourced to algorithms. People joke about scripts being written by algorithm, which is obviously ridiculous. They can't do that. No, what they do is they use the algorithms to filter all of the available scripts to see what will be the most financially successful. There's multiple widely used services built to check over pitches and scripts and casting and use that to predict the box office numbers by looking at the successes of the past and applying that to the present. So if you submit Spider-Man with the nouns changed, that's going to be a smash hit. But if you make something original, get fucked. If your script isn't nostalgic, it just won't get made. Then weirdly, all of this race to the bottom nostalgic feedback loop shit actually makes the algorithms work better. It becomes much easier to predict that you want some nostalgia if you're already trapped in a loop of nostalgia, which again, that's not a prediction, but it is a pretty good outcome for them from what is obviously just a mistake. So maybe culture has slowed, but it's not just because of the tech. These algorithms have really only been around for the past 15 years, which is, well, this may be a good example of how stagnant things have become. There haven't really been any major technological developments since the noughties. We're even before then, right? It's really the internet, and that happened before I was born. So maybe we're in a bit of a stagnant time. But I think we've seen this sort of cultural stagnation recently. Towards the end of the Soviet Union, their politics stopped promising a better future, their culture became stuck in time, and they called it the Age of Stagnation. The dream had been that they would be able to manage society through complete subordination of the economy to the state. And in theory, the plan worked great. Of course, when it came to the real world, there needed to be constant readjustment. But over time, those with power stopped responding to reality with political change. And because of this lack of change, it was a system that could no longer handle the complexity of the real world. So faced with this decay, and with no promise of a better future, their culture began to just repeat the aesthetics of the past, which made actual engagement with politics become increasingly meaningless, while growth stagnated, the ruling class grew older and older, and despite the fact that everyone could see the society crumbling around them, no one was able to process it, let alone do anything about it. So when the end came, it was like a dream. Impossible, but at the same time inevitable. Our current societal project is that we could manage society through complete subordination of the state to the economy. And in theory, that's great. Of course, when it comes to the real world, there needs to be constant readjustment. But over time, those with power have stopped responding to reality with political change. And because of this lack of change, it's a system that can no longer handle the complexities of the real world. So faced with this decay but unable to imagine a different future, our culture has begun to just repeat the aesthetics of the past. Our politicians no longer promise better futures while growth has stagnated. The ruling class gets older and older, not just in politics but in business. The average CEO age is going up 1 year per year. Meanwhile, wages stagnate while housing prices increase, which works for people who got onto the property ladder but locks an increasing percentage of the population out of the market completely. In some ways, trapping entire generations in a childlike state. And we know that this system isn't working. The coronavirus has shown us that the market will put short-term cash flow above millions of human lives. Climate change shows us that it can't offer any future solutions, and we're supposed to just expect an unprecedented financial crash about every 10 years. It's not completely terrible, the average quality of life is okay, and stuff like the productivity stagnation doesn't really affect your day-to-day life. But it all just exposes how broken and absurd this system is. It cannot handle the real world. So it's not that history ended, it's not that we came up with the perfect world, it's that we can't imagine a better one. So instead of looking forward, we seem to be digging up the past and desperately trying to reframe it to shore up the present. Nostalgia can be a destructive, regressive force that traps you in an imagined past. But in a world that has no vision of the future, we can root around in the past and look for those positive moments and abandoned futures. Look at it critically and then keep moving forward. And use the reflective power of nostalgia not to make it the past now, but to imagine new futures.